We've been talking about Israeli culture and society, and so now we're going to move on to the rest of the region and talk a little bit about Egyptian culture and society and how it compares to other aspects of the Middle East. So with me today to talk about this issue is Professor Samer Shahata. He's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies. He was born in Egypt and is an expert on Egyptian politics and the Muslim Brotherhood. So thank you for being with me, Professor Shahata.
My pleasure.
So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what might be distinctive about Egyptian culture and society? What are some of the characteristics that we could look for to say that's Egyptian?
Sure. Well, it's interesting to note that Egypt is one of the oldest nation states in the world. There's been a centralized state there for thousands of years. So unlike many of the other states in the region, which are really 20th century artifacts constructed by British and French colonialism, there is a strong sense of the central state and an acknowledgement of central authority. So certainly that is one aspect of Egypt that differentiates itself from some of the other states in the region. But of course, most Egyptians, the majority, are Muslim. Something on the order of between 85 and 90% of the population is Muslim. 10 to 15% of the population is Coptic Christian. And religion is very, very important. In fact, I think a Pew poll that was done quite recently demonstrated that when asked about how important religion was in one's daily life, Egyptians ranked among the highest in the world. So certainly Islam, and of course Egypt is the largest Arab-speaking country. And so Egyptians, for the most part, identify as Arabs. But the question of identity is always one that's multiple, right? People have multiple identities. So I think Egyptians see themselves as Muslim or Christian, Arab, certainly, Egyptian also. And of course, depending on what region they're from within the country, I think all of those factors are important.
So a fairly diverse society then. It's a large country, a very large population, so a lot of different peoples, a lot of different backgrounds?
Well, there is some diversity, certainly, but with regards to culture, Egypt is surprisingly homogenous to some extent. There aren't really the confessional or sectarian groups that we would see in Lebanon, for example, or in Syria even, or in Iran, which is quite diverse. So there's some diversity, but I think it's fair to say that because of the length of existence and power of the central state, there is an Egyptian culture and an Egyptian identity that I think is quite unique.
So speaking of Egyptian identity then, how would this compare to the rest of the region? I mean, you've already talked about the historical background and how Egypt is an old country as compared to perhaps many of its neighbors. But in terms of seeing themselves as Middle Eastern, as part of a region, a larger region, is that at all reflected in Egypt or in other parts of the region?
I think it is very much so. But I would think that the larger identity that many Egyptians and many others in the region hold wouldn't be so much a Middle Eastern identity. I think it's quite rare, if at all, that anyone thinks of themselves as a Middle Easterner, right? I mean, the idea or the category of the Middle East is a 20th century invention. In fact, before World War II, much of this region was referred to as the Near East. And of course, this is a Eurocentric phenomena, right? It's the Near East in relationship to Europe. But there are larger identities outside of Egypt that many Egyptians, as well as Tunisians and Algerians and Moroccans and Sudanese, believe that they belong to. Certainly the Arab identity, and people speak of the Arab world. And you can think of the countries that make up the League of Arab States and so on as a linguistic identity, but also a cultural and historical identity. And then, of course, there is Islam, which is the predominant religion in the region, not only among Arabs, but also in Turkey and Iran and so on. So I think all of those aspects of identity, many Egyptians adhere to.
So just to be more specific, though, on this issue of Islam, there are some distinctions within Islam, too, within the region that are distinctive and that perhaps separate one another instead of bind them together. Can you talk a little bit about that, particularly the difference maybe between Shiite and Sunni Islam?
Yes, and in fact, there are also other smaller sects like the Alawites in Syria and so on. And I will get to that, but it's interesting to note that in Egypt, of course, the majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority of the population is Sunni. There's a very few Shia in Egypt, and in fact, most Egyptians have never even met a Shia. So in that sense, Egyptians don't really see this or don't define their Islamic identity in relation to Shia and so on, because it's just not prevalent inside Egypt. But yes, you are right that at different times, and in fact quite recently, largely because of political reasons as opposed to religious reasons, these sectarian identities can cause conflict and become more pronounced. So as a result of what we're seeing in Syria and the view that many have that Shia Iran is supporting Alawi president against a Sunni majority population, and of course also being supported by Hezbollah in Lebanon, another Shia group, and so on, there is an increase in a sectarian identity, Sunnis against Shia, as it were. But I think it's important to state that it would be mistaken to think that this somehow is an essentialist religious identity. In fact, these are political conflicts, and they flare up at different times, and they wane at other times.
Very interesting distinction to make between being secular and religious as opposed to a certain kind of religion versus another kind of religion.
That's exactly correct. And I think there's something else that needs to be said as well, which is there is a sense, particularly in the West, that somehow Islam is a religion different than others, meaning that Islam defines the individual who's Muslim, and that those Muslims aren't also, women and men, soccer fans or football fans, and that other aspects of their identity, their professional identity and so on, aren't important as well. And in fact, just as there are Christians and Jews who don't follow all of the strictures and guidelines of Christianity and Judaism, there are Muslims who, don't as well. So I think being a Muslim can mean many, many different things, just as being a Christian and a Jew or a Hindu can mean many different things as well.
So let's return just for a second to the subject of language. The Arabic language you mentioned as a kind of a binding kind of cultural characteristic, but there are also significant distinctions within the Arabic language in terms of the dialect, the Levantine dialect, an Egyptian dialect, the kind of Arabic that's spoken in Morocco, for example, very different. So, I mean, how does the language really bind them together when sometimes they can't even understand each other's Arabic?
That's correct. And in fact, there are other distinctions as well: urban, rural, socioeconomic class, level of education, and so on. Arabic is a diglossic language, so there is a formal written language that you can read in newspapers and in texts and so on, which doesn't really vary significantly from Morocco to Saudi Arabia and so on. But you're quite correct that there's a great deal of variation in the spoken language. Egypt, as a result of it being the largest, most populous Arab country, but also as a result of a historical accident in a way, that in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Egyptians dominated popular culture in the region. They produced movies and films and serials, and the radio was quite powerful and so on. So most Arabs, interestingly enough, can understand Egyptian Arabic, whereas that's not the case for Moroccan Arabic or Tunisian Arabic or Gulf Arabic, as it were. But you are correct that these differences in spoken language do differentiate as much as they unite in some cases.
I'm glad you raised the issue of pop culture, because I'd like to ask a little different question, and that is about things like film and music and food even, and how you might find those. I mean, it sounds to me like Egyptian film and music might be quite pervasive across the region, but food even. I mean, how are these things somehow binding and shared across the Middle East?
Well, there's also a great deal of variation among food. I mean, in North Africa, of course, grains are much more common. Couscous is a kind of staple and so on, which is unknown really in Egypt and some parts of the Levant. And when it is used, oftentimes it's used as in a sweet rendering as opposed to a kind of savory rendering. And because Egypt is an agricultural society with the Nile, or at least was with the Nile Valley and so on, there are the kinds of meats and stews that you would find among traditional villagers, which really makes up the staple of Egyptian cooking, as opposed to, say, in Lebanon, for example, or in Turkey. But there are some things that are common now in the 21st and 20th century, such as the prevalence of some food items that maybe aren't as popular in the United States or in the West. Eggplant, for example, tomato-based dishes, cumin, basil, and so on. But it's unknown to me the origins of these things, because as you know, oftentimes these vegetables originated someplace else and then were transported and have then become quite common.
Well, so on that note, and kind of the last question I have for you, part of this course, well, a big part of this course, we've been talking about globalization and how ideas and cultures and, of course, economics, trade, all those things transcend borders, and things are flowing around the world, not just goods and services and capital, but people and cultures and different forms of societal factors. Have you noticed that there's been a significant influx in the Middle Eastern region of things from outside the region? I mean, you just mentioned food products, for example, but other aspects of culture that might be having an impact on the Middle East. How do those in the Middle East accept that invasion, if you will, of outside cultural products or cultural ideas and ways of life?
Yes. Well, there was in the academic and popular literature in the 1990s a great deal of critical discussion and really criticism in the Arabic press about awlama, which is globalization. And it was seen as a threat somehow, robbing traditional culture and so on of indigenous practices. And in fact, it was seen not only as globalization, but as westernization, as kind of Hollywood movies and McDonald's supplanting, local foods and local traditions and so on. Look, there are McDonald's in Cairo, and they're quite popular, and in Amman and in other cities in the region and so on. But I think it's also interesting to note that partially because of the media revolution and satellite television and so on, there's also and has been a new emerged Arab sphere because of television stations like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and so on, and the Egyptian satellite station and many others and so on. Arabs are watching TV about events in the Arab world, whether it's in Morocco or Iraq and so on. So that's another aspect of globalization as well, a kind of regional aspect of globalization.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Professor Shahata, for sharing your insight about this with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
So students, what do you think? As we've been doing throughout this class, put on those lenses and see the world as if you were from the Middle East, perhaps from Egypt or another part of the region. How would you see relations within the region and perhaps with others outside the region, maybe even with the United States? Tell us what you think.